Since May the 9th, 2016, Austria has been in a cabinet crisis, prompted by the sudden resignation of Mr. Werner Faymann, both as the Federal Chancellor or Prime Minister of Austria and as the Austrian Social Democratic Party's federal leader. He had been facing growing criticism for his style of governance and for he is dealing with Austria's problems such as the refugee crisis. He had served as the Federal Chancellor since December 2008, all the time in a so-called Grand Coalition with the centre-right Austrian People's Party. That coalition's majority, however, has steadily fallen, and currently they only have 99 deputies out of 183 in the Austrian Federal Parliament's lower and directly elected House, the National Council. Austria is also in the middle of a presidential election campaign, and specifically its final stage, the second round of voting, which will happen on May the 22nd, 2016, and where the populist right-wing Freedom Party's candidate, Mr. Norbert Hofer, is favored to win. Anyway, Federal Chancellor Faymann is said to have moved his once solidly pro-European party, the Social Democrats of Austria, toward a more EU-skeptic course. However, he has never succumbed to anti-immigration rhetoric and has kept his distance from the populist right-wing and far-right parties. In domestic affairs, his administration has been notable in enacting a wide range of reforms in areas such as education and social security. On the first round of the Austrian presidential election, held on April the 24th, 2016, both the Social Democrats and the People's Party suffered a humiliating defeat. Their candidates only received 11% of the vote each, which means that whoever wins the second and decisive round of these presidential elections will be the first president from outside the two main traditional Austrian political parties in this Second Republic of Austria, starting in early July 2016, when the incumbent president, Social Democrat, or originally Social Democratic, Heinz Fischer, who is currently an independent, will step down, having served his constitutionally allowed 2 terms or 12 years as president. The situation is difficult because either there must be an interim federal chancellor, and that role is currently being held by the People's Party's leader until the new president takes office in early July 2016, or in the dying weeks of his presidency, Mr. Heinz Fischer must then appoint a new Austrian federal chancellor. And even though in Austria, contrary to its northern neighbor Germany, the federal chancellor doesn't have to win a vote of confidence from the parliament, or specifically from the parliament's lower house, nor does his or her appointment have to be formally approved by the lower house. Still, in practice, the federal president only appoints a federal chancellor who is likely to command majority support in the Austrian parliament, specifically in the Austrian National Council, because it's clearly more powerful than the upper house of Austrian federal parliament, the Federal Council, which can, in normal cases, only delay legislation, not defeat it. Mr. Hofer has said that should he win the Austrian presidency, He will use, if necessary, at least two reserve powers of the Austrian federal president, namely his right to dismiss the federal government and to call early parliamentary elections. There is, however, one limitation on the Austrian president's use of the dissolution power concerning the National Council. He or she must every time indicate a reason for doing so, which leads to the second restriction. Should the same federal president at least twice dissolve the National Council, he or she must each time indicate a different reason for so doing. This safeguard, or these safeguards, probably were put into the Austrian federal constitution in order to prevent the Austrian federal president from abusing his or her power to dissolve the National Council without the Austrian government's or the National Council's own initiative. The Austrian People's Party's current leader, Mr. Reinhold Mitter-Lehner, is the Austrian Federal Economy Minister and Vice Chancellor, that is, Deputy Prime Minister, and following Federal Chancellor Feynman's resignation, he is now serving as the interim Federal Chancellor. Some interesting information on him. After the Austrian People's Party lost votes in provincial elections to the populist right-wing anti-immigration Freedom Party in 2015, Economy Minister and Vice Chancellor Mitter-Lehner publicly threatened to quit the coalition government if Federal Chancellor Feynman's Social Democrats did not toughen their policies on migrants and shrink the welfare state. At least the first demand they have fulfilled. Let's look at the local, the English language, probably the principal English language news website on Austria. What it has to say about the government crisis. Anyway, the situation somewhat resembles the one 30 years ago when Social Democratic Federal Chancellor Fred Zinovats resigned, although he resigned only after Mr. Kurt Waldheim, a former Secretary General of the United Nations, who had served as a diplomat for a long time after the Second World War and was the People's Party's presidential candidate, first in 1971, when he lost to the incumbent Social Democratic Austrian Federal President, Mr. Franz Jonas, and then again in 1986 when he succeeded in defeating his Social Democratic opponent, Kurt Steirer. The situation, however, was much easier for the two Austrian main political parties back in 1986 because they had at least 90% of the seats, probably more, in the Austrian National Council, although at that time Austria had a so-called small coalition between the Social Democrats and the People's Party, which happened back then to have a moderate liberal leader, Mr. Norbert Steger, as Vice Chancellor. Two possible candidates for the new Austrian Federal Chancellor are Mr. Christian Kern, 50 years old, head of the National Railways Company, and Mr. Gerhard Zeiler, 60 years old, former chief of the Austrian National Broadcaster ORF. A decision may be taken at a party meeting on May the 17th. According to Ms. Karin Tsvrtila from the OGM Polling Institute, it would be good to have a new face as the new Austrian Federal Chancellor, someone from outside the Social Democrats. Although Ms. Tsvrtila also said the Social Democrats' decision will have a momentous impact. Whether to exclude the populist right-wing Freedom Party from the government or to team up with it, as the party has done in the eastern Austrian state of Burgenland. Former Federal Chancellor Franz Vranitzky, among many others, has backed such a move. It could also tear the Social Democrats apart. According to political analyst Mr. Anton Pelinka from Innsbruck University, it would be a very dangerous action, and it could potentially drive voters towards the Greens. He claims that the Social Democratic Party of Austria is completely stumped and confused. Between 2000 and 2007, the Freedom Party did participate in the federal government together with the Austrian People's Party. And one result was that the Freedom Party temporarily lost over half of its supporters. However, there were massive demonstrations, and Austria was being ostracized temporarily in the European Union. And as in various other European countries, the center-left Social Democrats, but also the center-right People's Party, have gradually lost support to fringe, populist, and even extremist groups. The only chance that Mr. Alexander van der Bellen, who is the Green Party's official presidential candidate, to win the decisive second round of the presidential election is to have enough support, not just from the traditional Social Democratic and People's Party voters, but from the supporters of the more popular of two independent presidential candidates, Ms. Irmgard Gris, who received some 18 or 19% of the vote on the first round of the presidential elections.